A new Sunday Times investigation in the UK has shed light on China's takeover of the WHO, the World Health Organization, and other UN bodies. Despite the United States funding of the WHO before they pulled out, it was to the tune of $853 million. China paid off other countries to see Tedros installed in the role as Director General. And from that point on, he was beholden to Beijing. One of Tedros's first initiatives was to bestow the role of goodwill ambassador on the Zimbabwe dictator Robert Mugabe. This Sunday Times piece, and it's on the Australian's website if you haven't read it, details how Tedros himself had been accused of covering up Ebola outbreaks in Ethiopia when he was health minister. Not the sort of person you think should be running the World Health Organization when there are threats of a pandemic from China. Now, this also comes after a WHO official, Peter Embarek, admitted in a Danish documentary that he'd been pressured to rule out a lab leak from China. Peter Embarek is now saying it's actually a likely hypothesis that a researcher infected while collecting samples in a bat cave started this whole pandemic. And that's what we've been saying all along is a likely scenario. We could have written the WHO report. Yet it's not what his own report said. On the contrary, his report said that a lab leak was extremely unlikely. Ian Birrell is one of the few international journalists who's been writing about the possibility of a lab leak since June last year, and he joins me now from the UK. Ian, welcome, and it's great to meet you finally over the internet, over television. Look, I want to start with this backflip from Peter Embarek. How discredited is the WHO report now when both Tedros and now its head of mission have walked away from its findings?
I think the WHO report was written before the ink was dry, was discredited before the ink was dry. We knew at the time that it was absurd. We knew that some of the scientists involved were hopelessly conflicted. Excuse me, to include Peter Daszak there, the British scientist who had been involved in research with the Wuhan Institute of Virology for many years and funded it and was a personal friend of the scientist at the centre of all the controversies, was just ludicrous. To have allowed China to choose the participants was ludicrous. To give China even a majority view on the results of the report was ludicrous. And so it was no surprise, as soon as the report came out, that its contents were ludicrous. To say that the lab leak was extremely unlikely is now being presented as some kind of victory for the researchers against the face of the Chinese stance at trying to ensure there was no mention whatsoever. But it has left the WHO extraordinarily discredited. This new report that we've seen today in the Sunday Times merely echoes stuff that, to be honest, I wrote last April and others have been writing for many months. We've known since the start of this pandemic that this was an organization who had a director general who was put into power with the help of China, who has also been extremely compromised, and particularly in the initial weeks, those vital weeks when you can suppress a pandemic from emerging, he played a role in inflaming or basically sharing China's stance and participating in the cover-up. The WHO is left desperately discredited at the end of this, and it's very clear one of the things we need to learn is that we need to have a new sort of global public health architecture, which is not privy to national concerns through those who essentially run it through having a director general or the leadership beholden to it, whether for funds or for power.
Yes. Now, Ian, you've done a lot of work unpicking the links, particularly in the British scientists like Jeremy Farrar, to how this cover-up actually began. I mean, many scientists initially did think that COVID-19 may have been lab engineered, and we're starting to see this thanks to evidence of emails that are being unearthed through various Freedom of Information requests. But it was a phone call between Anthony Fauci, Jeremy Farrar, and some other scientists when suddenly the narrative seems to have changed. And from that point on, a lab leak was labelled a conspiracy theory.
Well, certainly it's a very strange series of events where we now know from all these emails that you refer to that in late January, the predominant view among experts in the field was that this virus showed signs of engineering, signs of possible engineering, and they all feared a lab leak. Most of them, if pushed at the time from what we've seen, actually favoured the idea of a lab leak over natural zoonotic transmission. Then suddenly they get sent, a paper is sent to Dr. Anthony Fauci, which talks about a research done by Wuhan Institute of Virology in conjunction with an American researcher called Ralph Baric. And it also talks about attempts to hunt down the origins of this. Dr. Fauci then circulates that to people and sees it as so urgent that Jeremy Farrar, the head of the most important funding research body in Europe, the Wellcome Trust, organises a meeting of 13 people, including himself, Fauci, and 11 of the world's top scientists, including Eddie Holmes in Australia. They then, within days, suddenly all seem to switch views and pushing this idea that it's conspiracy theory. Peter Daszak starts collecting names for a ludicrous piece in the Lancet, which puts forward the idea that this conspiracy theory to even discuss a lab leak and praises China for its openness and its transparency. We now know that there were similar ideas were pushed despite the scientists thinking there was a lab leak in other journals, in at least 2 other journals. And suddenly all these scientists start pushing the idea that it's conspiracy theory to even talk about the idea of a possible lab leak. I think it's very sad that one of the end results of this is that we've seen a scientific establishment led by senior scientific figures in alliance with the journals, which I thought we could all trust, and certain groups of the media and politicians have deliberately stifled debate on this by clamping down on debate and branding those who dare investigate it, dare raise the ideas of branding them conspiracy theorists. It's a real shame. And one result is it's only now we're beginning to have a proper search and discussion about the origins that we could and should have had Absolutely. At least a year ago.
Absolutely. And Ian, I think the best thing in the public interest would be for a recording of that phone call where they all decided, that conference call where they all decided this was a conspiracy theory. I think that needs to be made public now in the interests of transparency, seeing as from that point onwards, we were only fed one narrative and any of us who were investigating this like you were called a conspiracist. Ian Birrell, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Shara.